I am Denny Comeau, representing Student Veterans of America chapter at Bristol Community College and the Joseph A. Marshall Veterans Center. I'm interviewing Bill Comeau on Tuesday, November 19th, 2024 at the Disabled American Veterans Chapter 7 Meeting Hall in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Also present is Steve Reese from the Fall River Community Media, who is operating the camera. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project with the Library of Congress. Bill, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good. First off, I want to thank you for your service and appreciate you sitting down with the Library of Congress and telling your story.
Okay.
So, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and...
Okay, I'm a lifelong resident of New Bedford, Massachusetts. I was raised in a family. I lost my dad when I was 2 years old. My mom raised 4 kids by herself. I had 3 older sisters. I was the only boy in the family. And I went to Catholic school over here, grade school. Then I went to a vocational school to learn a trade.
Okay.
I was a machinist. And in July 28, 1965, LBJ determined he was going to have to send major troops to Vietnam. That was in July. In December, I was drafted out of New Bedford. There were 18 people on that bus that took us up to Boston Army Base prior to Fort Dix. And eventually I was sent to Fort Lewis, Washington, where I trained, prepared for basic training. Out of 184 men in my company, 180 were draftees. So they were pretty much filling in the infantry ranks with numbers. Yeah. And we trained together. We were a train and retain outfit. We went through basic training and advanced training, and we trained for 9 months. And on September 21st, actually, September 24th, we boarded the ship to Nelson M. Walker at the Comeau Bay. And on the next day, we left for Vietnam. We arrived in October 12th, and I was on a brigade-sized ship. So we were the last battalion to leave the ship. So for 3 days, I watched in Vietnam all the bombings and stuff that were going on. And when we arrived, finally, they put us on a transport, got us to shore, and we boarded Deuce and a Halfs, and they gave us 1 bullet for our rifle because they were afraid we would kill each other if they got ambushed. We wouldn't know how to handle that. So they said, if anything happened, just go in a ditch and we'll take care of the ambush. We were set up to a camp called Bearcat, which was an old 1st Division camp. And from there we did operations for about a month and a half. And right after Thanksgiving, before that, we marched in the National Day Parade, which is like Independence Day here. And the enemy shot rockets at the parade that day. There was a few people killed. My company wasn't hurt. So when we got back, we prepared, went out on operations for a while, and then finally we got sent to Dao Tiang, Vietnam, which was we were going to build a base camp there for my brigade. And it was right on the outskirts of the Michelin rubber plantation, which is the biggest rubber plantation in Vietnam, 6 by 9 miles. It's a pretty good sized one. Yeah. And from there we built up our camp, and we went out on operations, and the buildup and the American buildup was going on for a long time, but we didn't have enough men there as yet until January, where we could actually go into the enemy sanctuaries. And we did that starting in February of 1967, and went into War Zone C, and the enemy said, okay, that's cool, we'll just move out of the area, and they did. We found a lot of base camps, destroyed a lot of their food and camps. But they weren't interested in fighting us until they got tired of us pushing them out of the country. Finally, they massed for a big battle on March 21st. My battalion was out on operation 2,000 meters from a fire base where they were working out of. And we were rushed down to help them. The battle started about 5:45 in the morning, And we didn't arrive there. We got hit with rocket fire, and some of our men got killed. And we had to get them out of the area. And then we started heading down to reinforce Fire Sport Base Gold. Well, when we got there, they were down to smoke artillery rounds. That's what they were shooting at the enemy. They had no bullets. They had no HE rounds. They were shooting smoke at them. So they were pretty desperate. And when we got in there, we pushed them back out of the encirclement. And then 10 minutes after that, we had armor units coming in, and APCs came in, and they pushed them off the field. And they chased them in the jungle for about 500 yards, and our brigade commander says, okay, stop, because there's one unit I can't account for, and I'm afraid you guys are going to walk right into an ambush. So he pulled them back in. When we got back, our job of the relief force was to go out and pick up all the dead bodies. 647 Viet Cong laid in that field, and they dug a big ditch, and we put them on what they call a breaker on an APC. We would pile up on there. The APCs would come in and throw the bodies in the thing. After it was all over, they made the count. They found out that we had killed 647 enemy. 2,800 VC had attacked that base camp at 5:45 in the morning. They attacked the base camp, which was manned by 400 Americans, and they held them off for 3 hours until we got there. That could have been. Now this happened in March of '67, and late January was a Tet Offensive. Had they planned on overrunning and killing all of us.
So the battle was in March, and the Tet Offensive.
And Tet Offensive was in January.
January after.
After. Had we lost that base camp, had we all been killed, it would have been the Tet Offensive way. Well, we got to get out of there. So we really kept the war going for a while. So anyhow, since I spent the rest of my time in Vietnam, I spent on operation. I stayed there until August 21st. In August 1st, my affiliation, I was in the 4th Infantry Division. We changed affiliations, and I became a 5th Division soldier. So I was in both for a little while anyhow. And I came home and tried to put it all behind me, what I saw there. And I didn't realize...
What year did you come home?
1967, August 21st, 1967. I still had time to serve because I had 3 months to go. So they sent me to Fort Dix, and I worked as an attaché for Sergeant Major of a training battalion.
That's in Maryland?
No, that's in Fort Dix, New Jersey.
New Jersey.
Yeah. So I finished up my time, and like I said, I came home and tried to put it all behind me.
Okay.
That's the short and sweet of it.
I mean, that was, a harrowing story. Just want to unpack it a little bit, going way back to the beginning.
Sure.
Now, you said you were originally from New Bedford. You lost your father at an early age.
2 years old.
And you had several...
3 sisters older than me.
Okay. How do you think that taking care of your family, losing your father at an early age, I know you were drafted, but how did that kind of reflect on your willingness to serve?
Okay. I get asked that question frequently at my book readings. You have to understand the period when I came of age to serve. We all had, there were 5.5 million people who served in World War II, Americans, and everybody knew somebody who had served in the service somewhere. So it was a tradition. The Korean War came along. Now it's my sister's boyfriends that are serving. So it was like coming up on me, and I'm saying, I got out of high school in '64, '65 it all hit the fan, and I was drafted that year. So most of us, the question comes up when I have my book read, how did you feel politically about the war? It always comes up, so I get it out of the way quickly. We didn't feel anything of the politics. We didn't understand. It's very early in the war. We were still supported by the public. The body bags weren't coming out in big numbers, so the public was behind us. But our feeling was, okay, Dad went, not my dad, but our dads went, our uncles went, it was our time. And that's what we did. It was our duty as American citizens. Now, ironically, my dad was a Canadian citizen.
Oh.
He came here in the 20s to work the factories. So if I wanted to, I could go to Canada. I was a Canadian citizen also.
Interesting.
But I didn't even think it. I was an American. I was going to serve in the American Army.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty sums it up how I felt.
All right. And when you said earlier that you were drafted, you went to training.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned train and retain. My infantry experience was one station unit training, so all the recruits would come in, basic combat training, infantry school, and then they were dispersed. Can you talk a little bit about that model of train and retain?
Okay, there were the 9th Division, that happened that way. They were a train and retain division. 4th Division was a train and retain division. There was a quick buildup going on at that time. They knew we had to get troops to Vietnam quickly, or I would have fallen. And of course, their idea at that time was if Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would fall. It didn't work out that way, but that was the thinking. So when train and retain meant, I went through basic training starting on January 2nd, 1966. And I went through basic training, and then I went advanced infantry training, and then I went basic unit training. I went through all of those training periods right at Fort Lewis in my company. So I knew all of these guys for 9 months before I was sent to Vietnam, and we all got sent together, which is a good thing and a bad thing because you get to be really friendly with these guys. And when things happen, you start to see bad things happen to your friends. It really affects you mentally. Now, one thing I didn't tell you was one of our company members was a medic. I was at the 3rd Platoon RTO.
Okay.
And
Which is a radio telephone operator?
Yeah, a radio telephone operator. In that platoon was a guy named Richard Evans, and he was I thought he was old. He was 22. I was 19 at the time, 20 at the time, and he was married. And eventually, he and I got to be pretty good friends because we were walking side by side all during our training. So eventually we got into a big battle, and Richard Evans, I got to back up a little bit. I'm sorry. When we got on board the ship, I got a call from my company commander. I was a 3rd Platoon radio telephone operator, and I got ordered to headquarters company. I was going to carry his radio. So I was no longer in the 3rd Platoon. But Richard and Evans and the guys from the 3rd Platoon, whenever in camp, we'd get together. They were my friends. Richard Evans remained in the 3rd Platoon as a medic. January 27th, 1967, we got into a big battle. We didn't realize it. We thought we were hitting one base camp, and actually it was 3 base camps. It was a training camp, and it was only a couple miles from our base camp.
3 enemy base camps?
Yeah, they had found a base camp 2 months earlier, and they never told us. And the brigade commander was up in a bubble helicopter overhead, and as we're walking through the high elephant grass, couldn't see very well, he looked down and he said, okay, your front element stop, turn to the left and go into the jungle there. And when we did, we ran into that first base camp. And a big battle ensued, and a lot of people got hurt. They were dug in, they were ready, they were prepared, and they were in bunkers. Of course, we were trying to overtake them. We went back in 2 more times, but we're picking up so many casualties, we finally had to pull back. We left 1 man behind, which you shouldn't do, but it was really costing us. Well, you take out your lead man and say, okay, come and get him, and then we'll pick you off one at a time. So commanders have to make those decisions. And the decision was made to leave him behind. The next day they went back and then they found him bayoneted, which meant he was still alive when they got to him, the Viet Cong got to him. So, but during that battle, Richard Evans, he performed heroically, and the commander who was running the company was the executive officer on that day. He had put him in for a Silver Star for gallantry. And the brigade commander shot it down. So my executive officer went back to interview the guys one more time. And when he did, he said, you know something, I'm going to put him in for the Medal of Honor. And he got all the information together. and did put him in for the Medal of Honor. Now, he finally did get the Medal of Honor a year and a half later, and that executive commander never was told about his request. He read about it in the Army Times and said, "Oh, guess what? Richard Evans finally did get his Medal of Honor."
And he was in your company?
He was in my company, yeah.
Do you remember where he's from? What hometown?
California. Oh, do you mean the Medal of Honor recipient?
Yes.
Yeah, he was from California, Riverside, and he was famous. He was from Riverside, California, and he went to the high school there. And to show you how bashful he was in track, and he was named the Athlete of the Year in his high school auditorium, and he asked that he not get that plaque in front of the student body. It was too bashful. So they gave it to him in the coach's office, and yet later on he performed admirably. Yeah, he went back in 3 times to pull people out of that battle by himself. So today I'm still friends with his wife.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. We like I said, we formed a group of veterans from my company. Got together in 2000. We formed Alpha Association, and we found 340 men who served in my company during that year and a half period. And we meet once a year, and we have reunions, and we all get together and tell war lies.
So the Alpha Association, where's the next meeting?
The next one will be, as a matter of fact, it'll be in Virginia because we want to go to the U.S. Army War College. I want not U.S. Army Museum because they have the Army anniversary year coming up.
Oh.
So that's where we're planning to go this year. Last year was Chicago.
Okay.
Sometimes we're in the East, sometimes we're out in the Midwest, because half of our company that was drafted came from the East Coast, half was from the Midwest. So we alternate each year where we go.
All right. Earlier in your discussion, you also mentioned that you were on a ship.
Yes.
And then you were watching a bombardment.
Yes.
And then you were in a landing craft going to shore.
Yes.
So for many people, they would imagine like a D-Day amphibious landing.
We did too.
Okay. Can you explain?
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
We were on board the ship. To me, it looked like a movie. To me, it was surrealistic to sit on the deck at night, and there were hills, and there were some battles taking place on the hills outside of Saigon, and you could see the flashes, and you could just barely make out the thumps.
You're relatively safe aboard the ship.
Yeah.
And you're observing this.
I'm observing the battles that are taking place on shore. And it was. I said, "My God, this is where we're going. We'll be there tomorrow, or in a couple of days." We went down a net to get into landing craft, and they taught us how to do that so we don't end up in a drink. And like you, we said, I was brought up with the John Wayne movies, and I says, "Oh boy, you can't see out of those things." And as we're coming into shore, I says, "Oh boy, this thing is going to come down, and we're going to have to run up." No, it was nothing like that. We got there, and the gate went down, and it said, "Okay, start walking to shore." And there was a band there that played Stars and Stripes Forever. And on both sides of where we went through were these young ladies who were wearing these, I forget what their outfits, a little white outfit that they wear when they get all dressed up. And they were over there and throwing flowers and everything, and it was different.
So it was a little, I'm not going to say anticlimactic, but you had one vision in your head. You're in the boats. Yeah. You're moving towards the beach, and the ramp drops down, and it's kind of like a welcome party.
It's nothing like what I envisioned after watching so many war movies as a kid.
Yeah. You'd also mentioned that you are a radio telephone operator for the company commander.
Yeah.
Now, communication's always important on a battlefield. What was it like? I'm assuming you were a junior enlisted. What was it like to be side by side and be the voice and the ears for the commander? What was some of the conversations or messages that were
Okay, one thing I noticed when I finally met my company commander after 40 years, first thing I saw, I says, "My God, I thought you were taller than what you really are." And my friend said, "That's because you were down on your knees handing up the phone to him because you didn't want to get up." And I said, "That's probably the case." But I was never more than 5 yards from him. in case something happened, I would run up ahead and he would take over the radio. Primarily, my job was, in battles, I never had to call in artillery. The commander always took that opportunity to do so. Primarily, I would be passing on orders from the company commander to the platoons, because I was a company commander. I was on the company net. So if my company commander would say, "Hey, tell them to stop up in the front," and I would pass the word on. Okay, stop up in the front. And at night, when I was on radio watch, I had to get a situation report from each platoon every hour. And sometimes guys would fall asleep. You have to understand, we're out there 21 days in a row, which is a typical operation. We're in for 2 days and we're out another 21 days. Now you're marching all day, you're going through jungle, which is pretty tough. It's pretty tiring. And as the day wears on, the guys are tired. They got to dig a foxhole, jump inside of it, and they sleep half the night and with a buddy, and they keep switching back and forth. And these guys would fall asleep. They were exhausted. I understood that. But when it happened, I still had to get that situation report. So let's say the 3rd platoon, he won't answer me when I'm calling. And I would call up the 2nd platoon and says, "Hey, pass it down the line to wake him up." And then after a while, they would call me back. And in a situation negative, most of the time it was. But it's ironic, some of the stuff they were half asleep. I remember one night, and I still say it now. And I called up, and one of the RTOs, he was still sleeping, and he was dreaming. And he tells me, "Somebody shut off the water here, will you?" And it was raining like crazy. It was the monsoon season. And I said, "No, the water's not running. It's that rain." Mm-hmm. But he was sleeping. He was talking in his sleep. Yeah. But these guys were exhausted, you know.
Yeah, I can. My own experience, I can remember being up for multiple days at a time,
sure.
And people start hallucinating and sleepwalking.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous situation because
sure.
You're behind enemy lines.
That's right.
And people can give away the position.
Sure.
And it's a risky. You want them to get rest, but you also have to maintain security. Mm-hmm. So it's very dangerous. And
yeah.
People often think about infantrymen or riflemen, and then the radio telephone operator isn't something that's always thought of, but mm-hmm. it's incredibly crucial to the mission and the operation. Mm-hmm. And you're carrying batteries. You're carrying your own combat load.
Yeah.
You're carrying the radio for the commander.
I carried 400 rounds, and that was light.
Yeah.
You could have as many rounds as you wanted to carry. Ammunition was not a problem in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got everything we wanted.
Yeah.
But it's heavy, like you say.
That's an additional weight. It's additional equipment, additional serial numbered sensitive items that you're responsible for.
Yeah.
The codes and the operational security. Mm-hmm. The code books and everything. So that's an additional responsibility that was put on you mm-hmm. that not every rifleman gets to experience.
Mm-hmm. Plus you become a primary target in a battle with that antenna sticking up in the air. Got an antenna, somebody with a little bit of rank is right near this guy. So you get a lot of incoming. But I got lucky. I never got hit once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you came back, you said earlier you wanted to put it all behind you.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about your reasoning, your rationale, your emotions, your feelings?
Well, by the time I came home from Vietnam, the public had already started to turn against the war. So when I landed at Oakland Army Base, I got taken there later. First I landed at Travis Air Force Base when I went home. When we landed, they told us, "Look, there's going to be some protesters here. Don't pay any mind to them." And we got off the plane. Sure enough, there were about 40, 50 of them. They were all yelling at us and whatnot. And, of course, we were calling them names. They were calling us names. We went into a building, and from there we waited for buses to take us to Oakland Army Base. And that's when I said, "Okay, you have to remember there was, at one point, 500,000 troops in Vietnam. And there were people coming home every day. So they really didn't go through a lot of, let's talk about your experience. It was like you're on your own. And the one thing they said is, if you think you have anything wrong with you, you'll have to stay at the Army base for probably about another 3 months. Of course, everybody put their hand up. I'm fine. I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm fine. And they asked me. One officer come up and he says, "Can you hear me all right, soldier?" And I said, "Yeah." "Okay, mark him down. His hearing's fine." This came back to me 40 years later when I went for a hearing test, and they pull out my records and said, "You were checked. Your hearing was checked, and you said it was fine."
Yeah.
But that wasn't true. We never had a hearing test.
Yeah, it was just a quick processing to get as
Just
little.
move everybody through.
Yeah.
They were just crunching people. But they did tell us, if you go into the cities, do not wear your uniform. Wear your civilian clothes. But of course, in my case, I was anxious to get home. I never stuck around. I think about it, that was San Francisco right there. And that was the summer of love. I should have gone and find out what that was all about, but I didn't. I hopped on an overnighter, came home. And I think most of us want to get home and forget about it. But you remember, I had two things going, my feelings about that particular period. If you talk to somebody about it, and I had all these amazing stories to tell, which I got in my book, but I had all these amazing stories, and it was, you couldn't talk to people. You get two responses from talking to people about, when I was in Vietnam, this happened, they would either fall asleep or they would get angry. So after a while, you learn, don't talk about it.
So
That's where we were.
How long did that period last?
How long that period?
Yeah, that kind of bottling it up or avoiding it. How long did that period last? Because I see you're in VFW 7239.
Yeah.
I see you're in the Alpha Association.
I didn't join any veterans organization until 2001.
Really?
Yeah.
So you got out,
I really bottled it up.
So you got out in 67?
67, yeah. 2000 we formed Alpha Association, and that's when I started to take more interest in local veterans organizations. But primarily it was the guys I served with. I felt I owed them to tell our story, because nobody's going to tell our story. And I was in the biggest one-day battle with the biggest kill of the war, and nobody knew about it.
This Suitre?
Battle of Suitre, yes. Yeah, that was the biggest one-day battle in a one-day battle. We killed 647 on that day. That's a lot of. The closest to it is 450 that were killed. And if you want to know what battle that was, go see the movie Platoon. At the end of that movie, that was the battle that produced the second most, 400.
So when you were, so it took you a lot of time to process everything, and then you came out get into the veterans organizations, the DAV,
yes,
the VFW,
right, yeah.
the Alpha Association. What did you do between that time, employment-wise?
I raised a family.
Great.
And we have the same problem here at the DAV and the VFW also, where we're not getting many men coming in, because they're where I was. I was working 6 days a week. How much time did I have for veterans organizations or anything? So I was raising a family, and I was a workaholic. That's how I dealt with it. And I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. So I was pretty occupied. Once the kids grew up, now I had some free time, and that's when I started involved. And I suspect that's what's going to happen with your generation, is they're going to come to a point later on in their life when they say, yeah, let's start joining it. I mean, when I was a young man, I was lucky when I came home in New Bedford. 2 days after I arrived home from Vietnam, 2 officers of the VFW knocked on my door, introduced themselves, welcomed me home, and they wanted me to join their chapter. And I went there for one meeting, and everybody was saluting, and it was protocol, and I just left that. So I said, I'm not ready for that just yet.
There's like a weird mix between you want to put it behind you and you want to avoid it, but you also have to move on with life and get a job and provide for your family.
Life gets in the way.
So it's kind of a mix of both. And there's a process, a healing process where like now I got a new priority, I got a new mission to raise my family and provide for them. So that's a coping mechanism, but there's also a way of not kind of dealing with the past as well. What are
And
some,
I wasn't, because talking to the guys at a reunion after a couple of years, they said, you know, you have PTSD. And they could see it in my writing because I published a newsletter. And in it, you could read it in between the lines. And they said, you really should talk to somebody. And that's when I went to the Veterans Center here in New Bedford, and they said, yeah, you got it. And I had a responsibility to my wife and my children to do something about that. There was this anger that was hidden there. And I successfully dealt with my PTSD primarily. Some people can't talk about it. There were too many things that I hid inside me for so long. I got it out. I wrote the history, and I started remaking friends with my older friends from the company, and realized I wasn't alone. We were all going through that. I'd say 80% of my Alpha Association members are suffering from PTSD at one degree or another. If you go out in that jungle and you're into a firefight, the enemy is 10 yards ahead of you, they're right on top of you. They learned that from the Japanese because they knew that artillery was coming in. And we had men who were killed from friendly artillery. I don't know if it was the same for you.
not in my unit,
Okay.
no.
Yeah.
But I could see how
We were
that close.
we were more afraid of the artillery than we were of the enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you had 19, 20-year-old kids on the other end of that, too.
Right. Yeah.
And things can go wrong.
What are some of the other, like, what would you give it, and what kind of advice would you give, like a global war and terrorism veteran coming back now, given your experience, your lived experience in Vietnam, your transition coming home, and I mean, you've dealt with the trauma exceptionally well. You're a published author. You're a member of the community, and you give speaking engagements. What is some advice you would give a Iraq war veteran, Afghanistan war veteran?
All right. My unit now is at Fort Carson, Colorado. And as being the historian for my company, I made some acquaintances up there. And I organized a reunion of the Battle of Suitre veterans. And this is where I was able to interview a lot of people who were there from other units. And I didn't know what was going on with them, so I learned that and was able to put it in the book. But when I go there, I always make it a point to go over to the 3rd Platoon RTO and say, you got my job. Of course, I did it 60 years ago, but you got my job. And I got to know people that way. But what I always tell them, don't forget the guys you're serving with. And they've been to Afghanistan and Iraq also. And I said, it may not be important to you now, but there's going to come a time in your life you're going to want to reestablish those connections. So always maintain contact with at least a few, because those few know other people. Yeah. And that's how when we went looking out for the Alpha Association, that started out with 8 people. And we said, let's go find the guys. And I was the locator, and I started making some calls. Well, before 3 years, we had 340 members that we found. And we got that by getting contact with, oh yeah, I've been meeting with this guy for the last few years. So we were able to form this unit. Of course, now we're down to 160 because we're getting older, and now some are passing on. But it was a wonderful 20 years that we got together.
Yeah.
And to be able to see these guys, I was the company commander's RTO, so a lot of times I would say, we found a base camp up ahead. We would have to go to the front, and I'd say, oh, especially when I got short, about 30 days. You sure you want to go to the front? And we go up to the front. And of course, okay, we're set here, nothing's here. Okay, have them continue on the mission. They would pass me, and I'd wait to get past me, and I'd have to get into position. And as they're walking by me, they all have this face, that look in their face like, oh shoot, what else is around here? And to see them at the reunion, and they're all smiling and laughing and joking. Some people think you go to these reunions and it's going to be, everybody's crying in their bed. No, we have a good time.
Good.
We had some fun together. And it's good to see them that way and to know that they were able to move on with their life.
Have you seen any like success stories? Any other published authors? Any other?
There are none in my company. But I've had success stories. I've got a guy that came into my company as a PFC, and he ended up being a brigadier general.
Really?
Yeah, he's a brigadier general, and he was in the Army Reserves. And I went to visit him, and it was fun to go here. And funny story, if I had the time, I went with a man who trained this guy when he was a PFC, and all the time. He said, I always wanted to meet this Al Peckham, who trained me, who kept me alive. And when he met him finally, so Al, I'm so glad that I could meet you. Thank you for showing me the way. So anyhow, as we're leaving, I forget what base it was, just outside. I forget what the name of the base was. But as we're leaving, I says, Al, do you remember him? He said, not a bit. So you have these influence on people and you don't even realize it until years later. I said, I remember you.
I say the same thing I work with student veterans at the college, and I always kind of everyone's so kind of caught up in their day-to-day routine that they don't realize that how they impact each other will have ripple effects way down the line. You can dynamically change the course of someone's life just by an act of kindness or showing them or guiding them through something that was confusing to them. You just open doors for them that they're going to remember. So that definitely reminds me of like what we do today with student veterans.
Yeah. That you don't realize, first of all, you don't realize you're writing history, and I don't care what war you're in. You're writing history. You're writing military history that's going to continue on, and it's your legacy to the regiment and the division that you served in.
Yeah.
So, but they don't realize that as a young man. You just, in our case, like I said, it was our job. Everybody else served. It was my time. It was going to happen no matter what I did. But you realize later on, hey, something? We achieved quite a bit. And I think that's where what our association now is able to say, my newsletters are called Alpha's Pride. And I purposely call that because we didn't have any pride when we came home. We're proud we served. We're happy that we were able to do our part. It was an unsuccessful effort, as it turned out, but that didn't matter to us because politically we weren't involved in it. It's our job. I'm a soldier.
And, what would you say to we talked about the veterans coming home from the global war on terrorism. You talked about your transition experience from Vietnam. What would you say to there's probably a few thousand veterans in New Bedford. Speaking as a native New Bedford resident, what do you think the veterans culture is? The veterans' history is specific to this city?
Well, I was told by the mayor that per capita New Bedford has more veterans than any other city in the state.
Really?
And I thought, yeah, that's possibly so, because when they came looking for draftees, they knew that most of us from this area, we were lower middle class, and we weren't going to go to college. We weren't going to find the outs. We weren't smart enough, for one thing. And the other thing, we couldn't afford to go to college. So, and that was a sad thing too, because after I got out of the service and I could go to college, it didn't even pay for my college.
Really?
And no, I still had to put money in. In World War II, they paid for their college. They gave them $200 a month to live on and paid for all their books. We had none of that, the Vietnam veteran. They just said, okay,
really,
go away.
Did you end up, so you went to school, you just didn't have
Yes, I went to school, I paid for it. I paid for 20% of it. They paid 80%.
And do you mind me asking where you went to school?
Yeah, I went to Aero Tech. I wanted to be, I really fell in love with flying. Oh. And I wanted to be an aviation technician. That's where I went to school, to be an aviation technician.
What was the name of the school?
Aero Tech. It's up in Bedford, Massachusetts.
Okay.
Hanscom Field.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's where I went to school. And then, of course, there were so many guys coming out of the service at that time. when I graduated and I got my licenses, I couldn't get a job in the aviation field because all the Air Force guys coming back from Vietnam were grabbing them. So, but that's okay. I found a pretty interesting job. I liked fixing things.
Great.
And that's what I did. I was a technician in a book factory, which was perfect. I could bring any books we printed, I could take home if it was damaged. So I knocked the corner off and I could take it home.
Books?
Books, yeah.
So
and they were college books.
Oh, so
this is an extension of my education.
Yeah, absolutely. You're kind of like an autodidact where you taught yourself. You need to go to school when you can just learn and teach yourself. Yeah. Because you had all the textbooks.
Sure. Well, I was a big reader too.
Do you think that played into your role as being a historian?
Yes.
Huh?
Yeah. That and going to movie theaters as a young kid. It was because I could recognize what made a story interesting. You put the little hooks in and you leave it for later, and then you say, okay, by the way, let me get back to this.
Interesting.
There was little things like that I know. But that was my only escape as a young man because we had no money. Obviously, my mother was a widow, but she had 12 cents to let me go to the Capitol Theater on Saturdays, and I would watch these double reelers, and I'd take it all in. It was my escapism. And of course the library, when I got my library card, this opened up a whole new world to me.
Yeah. Being
able to go and read about these marvelous places as a young man.
Yeah, I think libraries are a hidden gem in every community.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So that was a big deal. I used to have to walk 1.5 miles to get to that library too. And I didn't mind. Everybody walked in those days. You ever see people walking on the avenue?
I still do.
You see the kids playing on the street, on the sidewalk?
Not too much.
They were always there. We used to play in the street. There was so few cars you could get away with that. But it was a different life back in the 1950s and 60s.
Okay. You mentioned you have a reunion going on next year.
Yes.
What else is going on for you in the near future?
Well, yesterday I got commissioned to do a historical study on a veterans transition house across the street. Jim Reed over there had called me and he asked me to do that. He says, we don't have any history of our building over here, and I'd like you to do it, seeing as you're an historian. And you become an historian, I always thought you become an historian by going to college and learning all of these things that can help you along the way, but you can teach yourself too.
Yeah, you just have to have that level of curiosity.
I loved history as a kid.
Yeah, and especially with like the military, you were talking about military history.
Sure.
And you're writing history. So we always have this kind of theme of every unit's battles that they were in, Medal of Honor recipients or commanders that were influential. We have our histories and our heroes, and that builds esprit de corps in our Alpha Pride and our regimental pride and our unit esprit de corps. Not organizations like civilian companies, for-profit, non-profit, communities like New Bedford, they also need historians and their histories and their heroes so that we can have a shared identity and shared storytelling. So by you being a reader and having that curiosity, I think is going to do good for the Veterans Transition House because you're going to leave them with something to be proud of, their history and their heroes, that they'll have their own esprit de corps.
This building, I did a study on this building. I did a history of the DAV here. This building goes back to 1850. It was owned by a doctor.
And he was in the 186th Infantry Brigade?
No, he was just a doctor in 1850. He died. His wife had no money, had no husband. She sold the money to the city. The city used it and set up what would have been, we'd call a police station, but it was called a washer's station.
Okay.
There was a big door up in the front. That's where the horses would come in. They'd be down on this floor. On the top floor was in the jail.
Was it what?
A jail.
Okay.
That's where they would put people when they would catch them. Of course, they called them watchers because there were no police in 1850. They were called watchers, and mainly it was to protect the businesses.
Okay.
And I did a study here. I did a couple of other historical videos on my VFW post. There's a Thomas Tuttle. Who is this guy? Well, come to find out, I was able to locate his namesake, his grandson. And I was able to do some research and found out that he was lost in World War II. He was it's a big long story, but he's an interesting character. But he was he was in an airplane, he was in the naval aviation, and they were flying to see where the Japanese fleet were, and he never made it back. So he was missing in action, he never made it back here. But there was a lot of things I liked. I'm fascinated with history. When I was a kid, I wasn't happy. I wasn't really enjoy going to school, but I did like history because I said, this is nice. All I got to do is remember a story. I can do that.
Yeah.
So that was my first link to historical skills that I had.
Research.
Yeah. So that's how I started as a kid.
Great.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to let the American public know?
I know sometimes I meet with veterans, and I don't often meet with veterans of your generation. But if there was anything I could do to meet with these guys to kind of give them a heads up to what awaits them in the future and how they can benefit from the veterans organizations and how they can deal with their own problems, because sometimes they carry this burden with them and they bury it. Mm-hmm. In my case, I buried it in work. Mm-hmm. And it's not a fun life, and it certainly isn't a fun life for our families. And if I can make their life a little easier, I'd certainly look forward to that.
Yeah. And then one thing I didn't touch on, we mentioned that you're a member of the Alpha Association for 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment, member of Tuttle Post VFW
7239.
You're a member of Disabled American Veterans
Chapter 7. Yeah.
And then you're also a recipient of the Order of St. Maurice.
Yes, I am.
Do you want to explain what the Order of St. Maurice is and how you got the award?
I had been doing a lot of research, and I got to be recognized by the 4th Division Association president. And the 12th Infantry Regiment was putting up a monument at Fort Benning on the Walk of Heroes. And they were looking for someone who could research the 12th Infantry Regiment. I was kind of a natural for that, so they contacted me. And I had some fun with the historians over at Fort Benning, because every time I would submit, they said, well, we don't have any record of it. Okay, I'll send you the record of it. So finally I got to do my story, and when we put the monument up, I stand on the side of it. It's about a plaque about that high, and it's all written all the way to the bottom, going back to the Revolutionary War, when the 12th Infantry Regiment was formed, the original. Now, if you go to the Center of Military History, they'll tell you that the 12th Infantry Regiment was formed in the Civil War, the modern-day 12th Infantry Regiment. But the 12th Infantry Regiment really goes back to the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, when the first time they were formed from a group of men from New York, from the 12th Infantry Regiment, and they fought up on the border during the War of 1812. And the British were attacking in Baltimore, and they rushed my unit south. One of our battalions went down to Washington to try and save them, and they couldn't, and Washington was burned to the ground. The rest of my regiment was up around in Baltimore around the fort when the British attacked, and everybody talks about the people inside the fort. My regiment was on the outside and prevented the British Marines from attacking it from land. We drove them back into the sea. But that's why in Vietnam we're known as the Red, White, and Blue Regiment, because of that Star Spangled Banner.
Oh.
Yeah, so we're known as the Red, White, and Blue Regiment.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love the Center for Military History and the lineage and honors, so you can see what units the regiment was assigned to, what battles they were in, campaigns they were in. And I also love military heraldry. So I'm sure in your role as a historian, you looked at the heraldry for the regimental crest or the shoulder sleeve insignia for divisions. Do you have any kind of anecdotes or stories about
Well,
military heraldry?
Okay, the 12th Infantry Regiment was also called up in the Mexican War, and they didn't have that over at Fort Benning also, but I had the information. And when the 12th Infantry was so distinguished, when they got to Mexico City and they were going to take over that city and get they held up because the 12th Infantry Regiment distinguishes so well that General Scott says, wait, I got to have the 12th Infantry Regiment come up with us when we sign the treaty. Mm-hmm. So it's a very distinguished unit, yeah. And yet part of that is lost. Yeah. So when I publish my newsletters, I'm always looking for news stories. I did a history on that, and I told all those stories in the regimental crest, what each one of those symbols on it meant. Mm. And
I see it on your shirt, so it looks like a wyvern and two Maltese crosses. And
yeah, well, that goes back to the Civil War. The crosses, that's a Peninsula Campaign where they held off when Robert E. Lee was trying to drive them into the sea. My company took my regiment took heavy losses to hold them back and give them enough time to get on ships and get away. Mm. So they were quite distinguished with that. And they were in the Spanish-American War. That's where the castles come from. Okay. And of course you have the Indian teepees. Each one of the spokes is Indian campaigns that they fought in. And the Spanish-American War was an interesting one, I found, because researching that, the 12th Infantry Regiment was sent to the Philippines and to put down the insurrection. It took years. But that's where there was a lot of curiosities to that. That's when the word gook, we used to call the Viet Cong gooks, but that was first used during the Philippine insurrection. And that's when they named the enemy the gooks. And when they came back, one of the World's Fair that took place, I believe, in St. Louis, don't quote me on that, but anyhow, they marched in that parade, and they said that the 12th Infantry wore ragged clothes, and they were just they didn't march, they just kind of walked. These people were seeing things in the distance. They had gone through so much. Mm. And that's my regiment. I'm very proud of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Bill, I appreciate you telling your story and talking to me this morning. Yeah. And hopefully the American people will continue to read your book, continue to read your histories. The men of the 12th Infantry Regiment will kind of remember your name, and then this will be in the Library of Congress.
Oh, I never finished it. Oh. I was. You said, how did I get this? That was one of the things, because I was writing all this history. The monument was put up, and I received a plaque from the Secretary of Defense as a distinguished member of the 12th Infantry Regiment. So I was pretty proud of that.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So that's, and then the Order of St. Maurice is from the National Infantry Association.
Yeah. They finally recognized, this guy's doing quite a bit for the U.S. Infantry. We should recognize that.
Well, congratulations.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
All right. Thank you.